Welcome to Dark Corners with David Allen Voyles. Dark Corners is brought to you by Gestalt Media, an independent publishing company dedicated to serving independent artists. Dark Corners is a horror podcast and may not be suitable for all listeners, therefore discretion is advised. Season 2 consists of episodes written and narrated by David Allen Voyles, based on a story suggested by the Halloween-themed musical work Witchworks, created by dark ambient musician Mombi Yuleman. The 13th episode concludes the season in October of 2020. Chapter 9, Through the Pumpkin Swamp. Are you Daniel Thompson? The tall, clean-shaven man who stood before him under the porch light did not smile or flinch as moths fluttered around his head. The broad-brimmed hat he wore cast a shadow over much of his face, but the uniform told Daniel all he needed to know. Daniel had no need to ask for ID, since Sheriff Kovitz, having served for over a decade, was well known to all the residents of the county, even those, like Daniel, who had moved away. Although he had not talked with the sheriff when he went in to report the bones that he and Laura had found several weeks before, he had seen him in the office, and his face had been shown on numerous national news broadcasts after his son's murder. "Yes," Daniel answered through the screen door. "I'd like to ask you a few questions. May I come in?" "Sure." A sense of foreboding washed over Daniel, but as he had no real objections, he pushed the screen door open and stepped aside for the sheriff to enter. Kovitz did not remove his Stetson hat, but stood stoically and waited just inside the doorway for Daniel to lead him into the living room, where Daniel motioned for him to take a seat. "Why am I so nervous?" Daniel thought, as he took a seat in the rocking lazy-boy recliner. He took a deep breath through his nose to calm himself, and asked, "So what can I help you with, Sheriff?" The large man did not speak immediately, but looked at Daniel intently. "I bet that's a strategy they teach these guys in cop school," Daniel thought. Finally, the sheriff said, "There's been a lot of activity in your area in the last month or two." He waited again in silence, staring at Daniel. The silence made Daniel even more awkward, something he felt sure was deliberate on the sheriff's part, designed to make a criminal uncomfortable. Daniel waited too, rather than speaking, but eventually the silence seemed too awkward not to break. "I'm so sorry about what happened to your son," he said. "That was—" He searched for an appropriate word, but nothing seemed right. "Well, horrible." Kovitz continued to stare at Daniel, his face a frozen mask void of emotion. He offered no acknowledgement of Daniel's statement. After what seemed an eternity to Daniel, he spoke. "I read the report of your statements to my deputies from the investigation. You say you didn't hear or see anything out of the ordinary the night of the murder." "Right," Daniel said. "Well, coming back from a date to find a slew of cop cars at my barn is pretty much out of the ordinary, but I'm guessing you meant before that." Daniel mentally winced at his own choice of words. Idiot. Not the best time to use the word slew, he thought. He continued. "Laura and I had gone to dinner and then to a movie. I dropped her off at her place and then made the drive back here. It was pretty late." "Laura," Kovitz said. "That would be Laura Frazier, the psychologist?" The way Kovitz said psychologist put Daniel on edge. "Yes, that's right." "And would this Dr. Frazier be the same Laura Frazier that hunts ghosts?" "Oh, hell, here we go." "She has an interest in the paranormal, if that's what you mean." "I mean, does she hunt ghosts? It's a simple question." Kovitz spoke in a calm, quiet manner, but his hostilities seethed just under the surface. "She's done investigations at some places people say are haunted, yes. But you'd really have to ask her about that stuff. I don't know a lot about it." "How did you meet Dr. Frazier?" This is not going well, Daniel thought. He drew a breath while he thought of the best way to tell the truth without it sounding incriminating. I ran into her up at the factory ruins. Why were you at the ruins? I saw a light and thought I'd check it out. You saw a light in the ruins from here? Kovitz's expression showed his doubt. Well, not from here. I was in the woods. And what were you doing in the woods, Mr. Thompson? Oh, shit. Should I lie or tell him about the crazy costumed people I saw and how I passed out or whatever? I had seen some lights in the wood first, so I followed the path on up a ways to see who might be up there. I saw the light in the factory from there. Maybe that's enough to satisfy him. Lights? You saw multiple lights, not just one light? Oh shit, do I tell it all? I thought it was several flickering lights at first. When I got further up the trail, I noticed the light in the factory, and that turned out to be Laura. No need to tell him about the people in costumes performing that ritual or whatever it was if I don't have to. Not even sure if I saw that or hallucinated it. The sheriff stared at Daniel for a few moments without speaking. Daniel fought the urge to say something. He's hoping I'll blurt something out that he can use against me. Finally, Sheriff Kovitz broke the silence. And what did Dr. Frazier say she was doing up at the factory? She said she was doing an investigation because she'd heard stories about the ruins being a possible haunted site. You know, being called the Witch Works and everything. And that's when you found the bones up there? No, that was on another visit. So you've trespassed on the ruins on several occasions. My family has been a part of the factory for generations. I've never thought of it as trespassing. No, I suppose you wouldn't. Especially since Sidney Johnson's dead now. He paused to let that sink in. When he spoke again, he used a false, cheery tone. Sounds like you may have come into quite a bit of real estate, Mr. Thompson. Is that right? Are you implying now that I had something to do with Mr. Johnson's death? I'm not implying anything, Mr. Thompson. I'm just asking questions. The two men sat in silence again, staring at each other. Sheriff Kovitz, am I a suspect? A suspect of what, Mr. Thompson? Of Sidney Johnson's death? Of your son's murder? Christ, I don't know. Of all those children whose bones are up at the ruins? Interesting for you to group all those deaths together, Mr. Thompson. Are you going to charge me with anything, Sheriff? Because if you're not, I think I've answered all the questions I care to. The sheriff stood and said, I think that's the most honest statement you've said all night. He walked to the front door and pushed open the screen and paused. Be sure you let my office know if you plan on leaving Maria Bay anytime soon, Mr. Thompson. He let the screen door slam, and the porch echoed with the sound of his cowboy boots as he walked on to the Cherokee Jeep parked out front. That son of a bitch sure as hell is guilty of something, Kovitz thought as he turned his vehicle around in Daniel Thompson's driveway. In the rearview mirror, he watched Daniel's silhouette standing still as a statue in the doorway until finally the door closed and blocked the light. The sheriff drove slowly up the gravel road that led back onto the highway, but as he approached the Thompson barn, he impulsively turned the wheel and pulled up behind the old structure and parked in the same spot where his son's vehicle had been found just 2 weeks prior. He got out of his car and stepped over to the crossed poles that no one had taken down, the poles that had borne his son's mutilated body. There was enough light from the half-moon that shone in the clear sky that he thought he could still make out the bloodstains. Scrapings from the pole had confirmed the blood as being his son's and no one else's. All evidence gathered yielded no other DNA. The pole had stayed up on his orders with the thought that keeping the crime scene intact might somehow become useful. The bastard might want to come back and celebrate the moment, he thought. Easy enough to do if Thompson is that bastard. Kovitz stepped over to the path that divided two cornfields, the path the girl said she and Stan had traveled on that fateful night. But her testimony had been so rambling, nothing more than the ravings of a hysterical girl, his deputies had said. They had insisted that he not be involved in the investigation, as had the SBI. The feds were on it now, and they would not be happy at all if they knew of Kovitz's interview with Daniel Thompson. Fuck 'em. I'll be damned if I'm going to stay out of this, he thought. What was that crazy shit she said she saw? Clowns? A man in a bear suit? And monsters like out of those zombie shows? Crazy bitch. She and Stan must have been smoking some really funky stuff. But the toxicology reports had shown no signs of drugs in either of the teens' bodies, and only alcohol in Stan's. A flickering light up the path caught the sheriff's eye, and he walked back to his car to fetch his flashlight. He walked at a brisk pace up the path through the cornfields, towards where he thought he had first noticed the light. Being hemmed in by the tall stalks made him feel wary, easy prey for someone who might be hiding to ambush him, but he was determined to move on and flush the culprit out if there was one. A rustling in the corn made him pause, and a dark streak shot out of the stalks from the right along the ground across his path, only to disappear again on the other side. What the hell was that? He shot the beam from his flashlight down into the corn rows where the object had gone, but he saw nothing there. Dismissing the distraction as likely being only a large rat and not deserving of any more thought, Kovitz resumed his walk up the path. I'll walk all the way to the witchworks if I have to, he thought. I know I saw a light. Soon the cornfields ended, and the ground was covered with dozens of orange gourds of various sizes among large green leaves and vines. Bet this was where Stan and his buddies got all their pumpkins. He smiled at the memory. More than the vegetation changed once Kovitz was out of the cornfields. The path no longer felt solid under his boots, but softer, like walking on a sponge. The rains from the afternoon had left large puddles that had not dried up, and he wished he had worn his uniform boots instead of his good alligator ones. A low groan caused the sheriff to freeze in his tracks. He flashed his light first to the right and then to the left and then back to the right again, uncertain as to where the sound had originated. Another groan, louder this time, and a rustling sound among the pumpkin vines behind him made him spin about with the flashlight. Can't see a damn thing except what's directly in the beam, he thought. He cut the flashlight off in the hope that once his eyes adjusted to the gloom, he might have a greater field of vision. And as he got used to the darkness, he was indeed able to see more of what lay in the pumpkin patches on either side of the path. But he noticed something very odd. Some of the pumpkins seemed to have an aura around them, a faint yellow glow. The light emanating from them grew stronger with each second that passed, and to his wonder and astonishment, Kovitz realized that the pumpkins had faces. What the hell? Many of the pumpkins displayed the familiar grinning or frightened faces so familiar at Halloween. Others seemed more monstrous, the visages of creatures only imagined in horror movies. The pumpkins appeared to have been carved into jack-o'-lanterns while still on the vine. Someone had to have lit all these, the sheriff thought. His hand dropped to the .45 he carried on his belt, and he unsnapped the safety strap and withdrew the weapon and held it out before him as he walked. If that person is still in the patch, they could be lying on the ground, hidden under these leaves. Kovitz stepped gingerly off the path and into the patches among the pumpkins, hoping that his movement might flush out his prey. He thought about calling out and challenging whoever it was, but since they could just as easily be watching him from the cornfields or from the edge of the woods further up ahead, he remained quiet. As he walked, the pumpkins grew brighter, and he saw that nearly all of them bore various faces. Some snarled, some howled, some laughed, but all had been carved to show rows and rows of sharp teeth. The sound of something slithering in the leaves accompanied a pull on his right ankle. Something had grabbed him. Kovitz shined his light down at his feet, and he saw that the tendrils of a pumpkin vine had wrapped itself several times around his ankle. More snake-like sounds, and his left leg from the knee down was suddenly gripped by more vines. The sheriff kicked and yanked his legs, trying to free them from the sticky vines, but they held strong as wire as more tendrils shot out to grab him, some flying through the air to wrap themselves around his arms and chest. Thorns broke the skin where they held him in their grip, and Kovitz felt blood running down his body. The beam of his flashlight shot wildly around the pumpkin patch as the sheriff thrashed and struck at the writhing vines. At times, the light flashed across shadowy figures dressed in shabby clothes on the edge of the cornfields, lighting them up with a brief strobing effect, and Kovitz had the wild thought that hideous scarecrows were lurching toward him. The vines held on with such tenacity the sheriff could not break free. They pulled him down to the ground, squeezing tighter and tighter, tearing his flesh with their thorny tendrils. Amidst his thrashing, Kovitz saw that the pumpkins themselves were moving in too. Their eyes narrowed and blinked as they seemed to leer at him. The mouths stretched impossibly into even wider grins as the vines pulled him closer and closer. Something bit with savage ferocity into his left leg, and the sheriff saw a jack-o'-lantern clamped onto his thigh with jaws as strong as a bear trap. He screamed and tried to beat the pumpkin to knock it off, but the vines held his arms close to the wet earth. Through his tears, he saw bare, dirty feet, human feet, although they were only partially covered in flesh. He raised his eyes to see the torn remnants of pants hanging around the emaciated legs from which those feet were attached. The figure that stood above him was a walking corpse, one called forth from some unholy grave. More decayed feet shuffled into his view, more corpses, wearing the rotten clothing on their rotting bodies that they had once worn as living men and women, surrounding him as he lay helplessly struggling against the pumpkin vines that held him like barbed wire against the damp soil. As if directed by an invisible conductor, the dead creatures dropped to their knees as one and began to feed. That concludes this episode of Dark Corners with David Allen Voyles. Music for Dark Corners was written and performed by Mombi Yuleman and can be purchased at mombiyuleman.bandcamp.com. For my latest projects, you can always find information at my official website, davidallenvoyles.com. And I invite all of you to join our Dark Corners Facebook group, where you can find background information on posted stories, previews of upcoming stories, and all kinds of other dark content. Hope we meet again soon in the Dark Corners.